A man, devastated by the discovery that his wife had been unfaithful, spent weeks brooding over his pain. He had always been devoted, and the betrayal cut deep. But instead of confronting her right away, he decided to take a different route, one that would allow him to get back at her without causing an immediate confrontation. He knew it was risky, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the perfect plan. He began by acting completely normal. He didn't let her suspect that he knew anything. He would come home at the usual time, offer her a smile, and engage in their routine. But in the quiet moments, he was calculating. He started working late on a few projects, leaving her alone with her thoughts. During these absences, he kept a close eye on her activities, making subtle inquiries into her whereabouts without raising suspicion. Weeks passed, and the tension was palpable. His wife grew restless. She noticed his behavior had changed. He was more distant, more elusive, but she never suspected that he knew the truth. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, he told her that he was going to visit a friend for a weekend getaway. The trip was a lie, of course. His real plan was to give her the opportunity to feel the same kind of freedom she had taken for granted. During the weekend he was supposedly away, he watched her from a distance, keeping track of the people she interacted with. As he suspected, she made plans with the man she had been seeing behind his back. He waited for the perfect moment, then returned home earlier than expected, catching her off guard. He didn't yell, didn't throw accusations. He simply looked at her and asked if she was happy with her decisions. His calmness unnerved her more than any outburst would have. The guilt washed over her immediately, and the reality of the situation hit her hard. For weeks, she had taken him for granted. But now she understood that her actions had consequences. The man didn't want to hurt her. He wanted her to experience the discomfort of betrayal and deceit from the outside, to fully realize what she had done. In the end, it wasn't revenge through anger or confrontation, but through the quiet revelation of her own guilt, that the man felt his justice was served. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy with unspoken words. His wife, visibly shaken, stood frozen, unable to meet his gaze. The realization of her actions finally caught up with her, and the remorse began to seep in, but it was too late for apologies to heal the wound she had caused. He hadn't raised his voice, but his composed demeanor carried a weight far stronger than any shouting could have done. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice small, barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I don't know why I did it." He didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, letting her words hang in the air. He wanted her to understand the magnitude of the trust she had shattered and the pain that her betrayal had caused him. But he also knew that no words could undo the damage that had been done. He had already made up his mind about what needed to happen next. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's not just about what you did. It's about the way you made me feel. Like I wasn't enough, like I didn't matter." Her eyes welled with tears, but they were no longer the tears of a woman who feared losing her husband. They were the tears of someone who was realizing the true cost of her choices, someone who was facing the consequences of her actions in a way that was far more profound than anything she had ever imagined. He gave her a long, searching look before continuing. "I need you to understand that what you did doesn't just affect us. It affects everything. The trust, the foundation we built, the love we shared. And that's something you can't just fix with an apology." She nodded, her face pale, her heart heavy with guilt. She had no defense, no justification for her actions. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "I think we both need time," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Time to think about what we want, what we need, and whether we can ever get back what we lost." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, alone with her remorse and the weight of the reality she had created. The man knew that true revenge wasn't about inflicting pain or seeking retribution. It was about showing her the consequences of her choices in a way that left no room for excuses. Over the following weeks, the distance between them grew. They didn't speak much, both of them retreating into their own thoughts. He spent his time focusing on his work, his well-being, and his own healing. She, on the other hand, spent countless hours reflecting on her mistakes, slowly coming to terms with the fact that she had lost the one person who had truly cared for her. In the end, the man didn't need to force her into a confrontation or make her beg for forgiveness. His silent, calculated actions had spoken louder than any words could. The emotional toll of her betrayal was more than enough to make her understand the depth of her mistake. And perhaps, just perhaps, the love she had taken for granted was something worth trying to rebuild. But for him, it was no longer about revenge. It was about moving forward, whether with or without her. Weeks passed, and the silence between them grew heavier. She attempted to reach out, but he remained distant, his heart guarded. One evening, as he was preparing to leave for another business trip, she finally approached him, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try, if you'll let me." He paused, staring at her, the weight of everything still lingering. He had already gotten his justice in the quiet way she had come to understand the gravity of her actions. "I don't know if we can fix this," he said quietly, "but I'll need time to figure it out." With that, he walked out, leaving her with the truth. No matter what, she had broken something that might never be repaired. And he, though hurt, was no longer the man who needed revenge. He was just someone trying to heal. In the following months, they both tried to navigate their separate lives, but the weight of the betrayal lingered. She made efforts to show her remorse, attending counseling and making gestures to rebuild trust, but he remained distant, unable to forget the fracture in their relationship. One evening, after a long day, she sat across from him, her voice steady. "I know I can't undo the past, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure I can let go of what you did. I don't know if we can go back to what we had." Her heart sank, but she understood. The damage was done, and the road to healing was uncertain. For him, the revenge wasn't just in the betrayal. It was in the quiet realization that the love they once had might never be enough to erase what had been lost. Days turned into weeks, and their home became filled with an uncomfortable stillness. She continued to make efforts, small steps to show she had changed, but he remained emotionally distant, caught between his lingering hurt and the love he once felt. They existed together, but not as a couple. They spoke less and less, only discussing necessities, as if they were strangers forced to share the same space. One evening, as the tension reached a breaking point, he stood at the door, keys in hand. "I think we need a break," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I can't keep pretending things are okay when they're not." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I understand," she whispered, feeling the finality of his words sink in. He stepped outside, leaving the door ajar behind him, not knowing if he would ever return. The man had planned his revenge not in anger or bitterness, but in the quiet realization that sometimes the greatest punishment was the loss of something once cherished, something that could never be reclaimed. The days that followed were filled with a sense of emptiness. She tried to reach him, sending messages, calling, but he never responded. She stayed at home, reflecting on her mistakes, replaying the moments of their life together, wondering where things had gone wrong. Then one day, she received a letter from him. It wasn't a plea to reconcile or an angry outburst. It was a simple, carefully written note that explained everything. "I'm not blaming you for everything," he wrote. "We both lost something in this, but I can't pretend that things haven't changed. I need to find out who I am without holding on to the past. I think we both do." She read the letter over and over, each time feeling the weight of his words more deeply. He wasn't angry anymore, but he was resolved. The quiet distance between them had made him realize that the only way forward was alone, at least for now. It wasn't the revenge she had expected, but it was the closure they both needed. And as she sat in the silence of their home, she finally understood. Sometimes the greatest lesson came not from what you could fix, but from what you could let go of weeks past. And though the pain of loss lingered, A strange sense of clarity began to settle in. She focused on herself, going through the motions of daily life while trying to understand who she was outside the confines of their relationship. The time apart gave her the space she needed to reflect on the choices she had made and the person she had become, someone she didn't recognize. One afternoon, as she sat in a cafe, lost in thought, her phone buzzed. It was him. Just a simple text, but one that made her heart race. Asterisk, can we talk? Asterisk. She stared at the screen, her breath catching. There was no promise in the message, no guarantee that things could be fixed. But something had shifted in both of them. Maybe it was a distance, or maybe it was a realization that there was still something worth salvaging. But whatever it was, it felt like the first step toward a new chapter. She replied, asterisk yes. When, asterisk, the meeting was brief, not filled with grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but with quiet understanding. They spoke honestly, each admitting their own faults, but also acknowledging the love that still lingered, even if it was buried beneath the rubble of betrayal. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, an understanding that healing would take time and that they would have to rebuild trust one small step at a time. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had, he said softly, but I'm willing to try if you are. And for the first time in months, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together or apart, but with the understanding that they both had the power to shape their own futures, regardless of what had come before over the following months. Their attempts at rebuilding were slow and cautious. There were moments of tension, of doubt, and of regret, but there were also moments of understanding, of shared vulnerability. The road wasn't smooth, and both of them struggled with the weight of the past. But they were learning to communicate in ways they never had before, openly, honestly, without pretending everything was perfect. They started by going to therapy together. It wasn't a quick fix, but it allowed them to untangle the complex web of emotions they had been avoiding. He began to express the hurt he had kept hidden, and she, for the first time, understood the full extent of the pain she had caused. It was raw, and at times it felt overwhelming, but it was necessary. For her part, she worked on becoming a better version of herself, not just for him, but for her. She realized that her actions had been a reflection of her own insecurities, and it took time to address those underlying issues. The guilt never fully left her, but she began to believe that maybe she could be better, that she deserved a chance to prove her worth. They didn't move in together right away. Instead, they met for coffee, spent time talking, and allowed themselves to rediscover the connection that had once brought them together. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, and the occasional moment of doubt. But every day, they took small steps forward. One evening, after a quiet dinner together, he looked at her with a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen in months. I'm not sure we'll ever be the same, he said, but maybe that's okay. Maybe what we need is to find something new, a fresh start. She nodded, her heart aching, but filled with hope. I agree. I don't want to go back. I just want us to move forward. And so, they did, slowly, cautiously, but together. There was no guarantee of a perfect ending, no promise that their love would survive forever. But for the first time in a long time, they were both willing to try, knowing that healing and growth didn't happen overnight, and that, perhaps, was enough.